She never imagined that the day everything would change forever would be a cold and lonely one. She was walking through the streets, lost in the bitter, biting wind and the feeling of hopelessness that had weighed her down for as long as she could remember. There was nowhere to take shelter, no one to turn to, and the streets felt like they were swallowing her whole. She had learned to survive by keeping to herself. But today, she couldn't escape the overwhelming sense of abandonment. The cold felt different, deeper, as if it was gnawing at her bones. It was the kind of cold that made it impossible to focus on anything but the sharp, relentless wind cutting through her thin clothes. She tried to keep walking, hoping to find even a tiny nook to shield herself from the weather, but everything seemed out of reach. She kept moving, but the exhaustion began to settle in, making it harder with each step. The world around her was indifferent, as if she didn't even exist. She had gotten used to being invisible, to walking through the streets unnoticed, a ghost among people who never looked her way. At that moment, she thought about how many nights she had spent alone, just trying to make it through, with no one offering a hand. It felt like the universe was pulling away from her, leaving her with nothing but her own despair. But then, through the haze of the cold, she saw him. An old man standing in front of her, his face lined with age and experience, his eyes tired yet filled with something that made her pause. He didn't look like the others who ignored her, but there was something about his gaze that made her feel seen. Without hesitation, he spoke to her, offering her a chance to escape the cold. "Follow me," he said. "I know a place where you can shelter from the wind." She stared at him for a moment, uncertain, but the thought of warmth, even if it was in a cemetery, seemed better than staying outside. The wind was unbearable, and she had no other choice. So, without a word, she followed him, hoping that this stranger would be different, that he wouldn't just walk away like so many others. As they moved through the streets, she couldn't help but wonder why he had stopped to speak to her. Maybe it was just coincidence, or maybe, just maybe, he saw something in her that others had missed. As they made their way through the streets, she couldn't help but feel a mixture of fear and curiosity. The man didn't speak much, but she noticed the slight tremor in his hands, the way he shuffled with slow, careful steps. His movements were deliberate, like someone who had seen too much of the world and didn't trust it anymore. He led her through narrow alleys, and soon the sounds of the busy city were replaced by silence, broken only by the crunch of their footsteps on the snow-covered ground. The air felt even colder now, and she pulled her thin coat tighter around herself, trying to block out the icy wind. She could feel her body shaking, but it wasn't just from the cold. There was something unsettling about this walk. She had lived on the streets long enough to recognize danger, and there was something about this old man that didn't sit right. But the alternative was to stay outside, exposed to the cold and the uncertainty of the night. And so, she kept walking, keeping a few steps behind him, unsure of whether she was being led to safety or into something far worse. The cemetery was still some distance away, but the fog was beginning to roll in, making the path ahead even harder to see. It was a strange place to find shelter, but she had no other choice. When they finally arrived, the cemetery stretched before them like a ghostly landscape. The gravestones were blanketed with snow, and the trees were bare, their branches reaching up like skeletal hands. It felt like a scene from a forgotten dream, eerie and quiet. She had heard stories about cemeteries, about them being haunted. But in that moment, none of those stories seemed to matter. All that mattered was finding a place where she could get out of the wind. The old man walked ahead, showing her a small alcove between two weathered headstones. It wasn't much, but it was sheltered from the wind, and that was enough for her. She sat down, her teeth chattering as she pulled her knees close to her chest. The man, too, seemed to settle in, but he looked as though he were about to say something when suddenly he staggered. His face grew pale and he collapsed to his knees, clutching his chest. Panic surged within her. She rushed to his side, unsure of what to do. His breathing was shallow, and his body trembled with weakness. She didn't know if he was dying or just fainting, but she had no time to figure it out. She had to help him, but she wasn't sure how. As she desperately looked around for anyone who might hear her, her eyes landed on something something that made her heart skip a beat. There, next to him, was a leather suitcase, slightly open, with stacks of bills spilling out. The money was real. It was too much money. Her thoughts immediately began to race. She could feel her pulse quicken as she stared at the bills scattered on the ground. She had never seen so much money in her life. If she took it, if she just grabbed the suitcase and ran, she could escape this life. She could buy food, warm clothes, maybe even find a real home. But then, just as quickly as the thought entered her mind, she felt a surge of guilt. This man, though weak and fragile, hadn't done anything to deserve this. He had helped her. If he died here, if he needed her, she couldn't betray him for the sake of money. She made a decision in that moment. She would find help. She couldn't take the money. It wasn't hers to take. But just as she stood to leave, ready to run for help, a voice cut through the night air, freezing her in place. The voice was low and menacing, sending a chill down her spine. "No one's going anywhere," the man said, his tone sending an immediate wave of fear through her. She turned around, her heart racing, and saw him standing just a few feet away. He was tall, with sharp features, wearing a long black coat that billowed slightly in the cold wind. His eyes, dark and cold, locked onto hers, and she felt the weight of his gaze as if it were physically pressing on her chest. He looked dangerous. His expression, calculating and cold, told her that he wasn't someone to be trifled with. The air around them seemed to thicken with tension. She tried to step back, but her feet felt like they were glued to the ground, her body frozen by sheer fear. The man's cold voice broke the silence again, this time more commanding. "Hand over the suitcase." It was a demand, not a request. She gripped the suitcase tighter, feeling her palms sweat despite the freezing cold. Her mind raced, trying to think of what to do, how to escape. He took a step closer, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he was savoring her fear. "What do you think you're doing, little girl? Do you really think you can protect that old man?" His voice was mocking, as though he believed she was nothing but a nuisance. She opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. She wanted to scream for help, but she knew it was pointless. There was no one around. The cemetery was vast and empty, shrouded in fog, and she was alone with this man. He took another step forward, his gaze never leaving hers, and that's when her instinct kicked in. She had to run. If she didn't know what would happen next. But it couldn't be good. She couldn't fight him. She wasn't strong enough. So with her heart pounding in her chest, she made a split-second decision. She threw the suitcase in the opposite direction, watching as it tumbled through the air, the money scattering like confetti. The man's gaze snapped to the suitcase, and in that moment, she bolted. She ran as fast as she could, her legs pumping through the snow, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't dare look back, not even once. She could hear his footsteps behind her, heavy and determined, and the sound of him shouting for her to stop made her run even faster. Her body was already aching, her feet numb from the cold, but adrenaline was the only thing keeping her going now. She had to get away. She couldn't let him catch her. The wind howled through the cemetery, but all she could hear was the sound of her own heart racing in her chest and the thudding of the man's footsteps getting closer. She pushed herself harder, willing her body to move faster, but she knew she couldn't outrun him forever. She had to think of a way out, somewhere to hide, somewhere to lose him before he could catch up. Her mind raced as she turned a corner, eyes scanning the cemetery for any sign of cover. And then she saw it, a low wall, barely high enough to climb over, but it was her only chance. She gathered all her strength, sprinting toward it with everything she had left. She launched herself at the wall, her hands gripping the cold stone, and for a moment it felt like she was flying, her body weightless as she scrambled to climb. But as her fingers reached the top, she felt a hand close around the back of her coat. The force of it yanked her down, and she let out a sharp gasp, feeling the cold grip of panic tighten in her chest. She hadn't made it. The man had caught her. He was right behind her now, his breath heavy and cold against her ear. She struggled, trying to break free, but his grip was like iron. "You thought you could escape?" he hissed, his voice filled with malice. She kicked and punched, her heart racing in terror, but it was no use. His strength overpowered hers easily. He yanked her back to the ground, her legs kicking helplessly as he lifted her off the ground. He was too strong. His face was inches from hers now, and she could see the cold, calculating look in his eyes. "I don't like to play games," he said, his voice dripping with threat. "You saw too much. Now you're going to pay for it." Her throat tightened, and she felt the tears welling up, but she refused to give in to fear. She couldn't let him win. She had to find a way out, even if it seemed impossible. As he dragged her back toward the gravestones, she noticed something, a flicker of movement in the distance. It was so faint at first, she almost thought she imagined it, but then she saw him clearly. Another man emerging from the shadows. His face was hard to make out in the dim light, but his presence felt like a lifeline. "Let her go," the man called, his voice stern and commanding. The thug holding her paused for a moment, his grip loosening slightly. She took that second to react. With all her remaining strength, she twisted in his hold, kicked him hard in the shin, and then sank her teeth into his hand. The man let out a curse, loosening his grip enough for her to break free. In that split second, she ran. She ran faster than she had ever run before, not caring about the pain in her feet or the exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her. She had to get away. She didn't dare look back. Her mind was focused entirely on escaping, on finding safety, on outrunning the monster who was determined to drag her back into that darkness. The sounds of his footsteps echoed behind her, but she couldn't afford to stop. Her heart hammered in her chest, each beat a reminder of how close she was to losing everything. She glanced around desperately, searching for a hiding place, but the cemetery was vast, and the paths all seemed to stretch into the same hopeless dead ends. But then she saw it, a narrow path leading between two large tombstones. Without thinking, she turned toward it, hoping it would lead her to safety. She darted down the narrow path, her legs aching with every step, but she couldn't stop. Not now. She couldn't let him catch her again. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her chest heaving with the effort to keep going. The sound of his footsteps grew louder, and she knew he was right behind her, gaining on her with every second. She looked ahead, praying for an escape, but the path seemed to twist and turn endlessly, stretching out into the darkness. Her mind raced, trying to calculate her next move, but the fear was clouding her thoughts. She had no idea where to go. The cemetery seemed like a maze, and she had no way of knowing which direction would lead her to safety. She glanced over her shoulder for just a second, and that's when she saw it, his shadow, looming closer. He was faster than she had anticipated, and now she could hear his voice calling out to her. "You can't run forever, little girl," he yelled, his voice full of venom. Panic surged in her chest, and she pushed herself harder, ignoring the sharp pain in her legs. She couldn't stop. Not now. Not when she was so close. She needed to find a way out. Just ahead, she saw it. A low stone wall, barely visible in the dark, but enough of a barrier to give her a fighting chance. She rushed toward it, desperate to escape. With all her strength, she jumped, her hands gripping the top of the wall as she pulled herself up. She made it halfway over when she felt his hand grab her ankle. She screamed, her heart pounding with terror. But there was no time to think. With one final desperate push, she kicked him off, hearing him stumble back with a curse. She scrambled the rest of the way over the wall, landing heavily on the other side. She didn't stop to catch her breath. She ran again, this time without looking back. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stay in the cemetery any longer. She didn't know how far she had run, but she had to keep going. She had to find help. The sound of the man's footsteps was still behind her, growing fainter with each step she took. Her mind was a blur of fear and determination. She couldn't stop now. She could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, pushing her forward. Her body screamed for rest, but there was no time for that. As she sprinted through the dark streets, she caught sight of a faint light in the distance, a police station. It was her only hope. She had to get there, she told herself. The light was growing closer, and she pushed herself harder, focusing all her energy on reaching it. The thought of safety, of finally being free from him, kept her moving. The sound of her own heartbeat in her ears drowned out everything else until all that mattered was getting to the door. As she neared the police station, her legs were beginning to feel like lead. Every step was harder than the last, and her breath came in shallow gasps. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't afford to. The thought of Anthony catching up to her, of him finding her before she could get the help she needed, pushed her forward. She reached the entrance, her hands trembling as she pushed open the door. Inside, the officers looked up, surprised to see her standing there out of breath, clutching the suitcase like it was the only thing keeping her alive. "Please, you have to help me," she gasped, barely able to speak through her exhaustion. The officers exchanged skeptical glances. She could see it in their eyes. Who was she? A homeless girl showing up in the middle of the night with a suitcase full of money? She felt a wave of doubt wash over her. She had come this far, and now she feared it would all fall apart. She was just a street kid. Who would believe her over a man like Anthony? One of the officers, a middle-aged man with a gruff face, approached her cautiously. "What's going on, kid?" he asked, his tone suspicious but not unkind. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Her head was spinning from the fear and exhaustion, and it took all her strength just to focus. He poisoned him," she finally managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. "The old man. He poisoned him and now he's after me." She felt the weight of the words as they left her mouth, the truth that had been tormenting her since the cemetery. She could barely bring herself to say it out loud. The officer frowned, his expression unreadable. "Poisoned? And who's after you exactly?" She felt her stomach drop. She didn't know how to explain. She had no evidence, no proof, just the suitcase full of money and the terrifying man who was now chasing her. "His name's Anthony," she said, her voice shaky. "He wants the money. He tried to kill the old man, and now he wants me dead too." The officer's face hardened, but it wasn't the sympathy she had hoped for. Instead, he turned to the other officers in the room, exchanging silent looks. One of them nodded toward the door. "Let's check out her story," the officer said, his voice grim. "But first, we need to confirm this." They made her sit down while they made some calls, and in that moment she felt like she was being forgotten again. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling longer than the last. She could feel her body starting to tremble from the cold, from the fear, but most of all from the doubt that gnawed at her insides. Would they believe her? Or was she just a lost kid with a suitcase full of money, caught in a lie she couldn't even prove? The wait felt endless. Every second stretched into what seemed like an eternity as she sat there, her mind racing, her hands trembling in her lap. She could hear the murmurs of the officers, their voices muffled as they spoke to each other, likely discussing whether to take her seriously. She couldn't blame them for being skeptical. Who would believe the word of a homeless girl against a man like Anthony, who had the power to charm anyone with his smooth talk and polished appearance? As the minutes passed, she grew more anxious, the doubt settling deeper in her stomach. What if Anthony had already gotten to them? What if they were just waiting for him to show up and dismiss everything she had said? The thought made her heart sink, and the tears that she had been holding back finally started to sting her eyes. She blinked them away, forcing herself to stay strong, but the fear was unbearable. And then, just when she thought she couldn't take it any longer, the door to the station swung open. A man walked in, tall, well-dressed, and with an air of authority that immediately made her stomach turn. It was Anthony. She froze, her body going rigid as her worst fear materialized before her eyes. He didn't even glance at her at first. His focus was entirely on the officers, his voice calm and collected as he explained that he was there to retrieve his employer's suitcase of money, the same one Lucy had been carrying. "This girl stole it," he said smoothly, his words so convincing, so full of false sincerity, that she could feel the entire room shift against her. The officers turned toward her, their eyes filled with suspicion now. She could see it in their expressions. They were doubting her. She was just a kid, and he was the respectable businessman who had been looking for his lost property. "Is that true?" one of the officers asked, his voice cold. She felt her heart drop into her stomach. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's not true. He's lying. He poisoned the old man. He wants the money and now he's after me." But her words were drowned out by the officer's dismissive look. They were questioning her, not Anthony. The fear of being ignored, of being misunderstood once again, was too much to bear. She could feel herself losing ground, the weight of the situation pressing in from all sides. They were talking about her, exchanging glances, and she was powerless to stop it. She had no evidence, no proof, just her word against his, and it felt like she was sinking further and further into a hole she couldn't climb out of. But then, something unexpected happened. The officer who had been speaking to her, the one who had seemed most skeptical, turned to one of his colleagues and gave a subtle nod. "We need to confirm this," he said. "We'll make a call to the mansion and check the security footage." Lucy's heart skipped a beat. She had no idea if this would actually help her, but it was the first sign that someone was willing to believe her, to take her seriously. She held on to that sliver of hope, even as Anthony continued to smile his smug smile, convinced he had won. The officer's words were the faintest glimmer of hope, and for a brief moment it felt like everything might turn out okay. But even as the officers made their calls, Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that it was all slipping away. The longer Anthony stood there, the more he seemed like a calm, collected man of power, while she was just a scared, homeless girl caught in the middle of something much bigger than her. She could see the doubt in their eyes, even as they spoke to the people at the mansion. What was a little girl's word worth in a world so full of lies? Anthony, on the other hand, stood with an air of confidence, his every movement calculated and controlled. She felt invisible, small in comparison. Her mind wandered, imagining all the worst-case scenarios. What if they didn't believe her? What if Anthony had already set everything up to cover his tracks? She was fighting for her life, for her survival, and yet all she had was a suitcase of money and a shaky story. She could barely keep the tears at bay as she sat there, her fingers tightly gripping the edge of the chair, hoping that something, anything, would turn in her favor. The minutes dragged on, and just as she thought she couldn't take the tension anymore, one of the officers walked back into the room. His face was serious and he held a phone in his hand. He handed it to the officer who had been questioning her. "We checked the security footage from the mansion," the officer said, his voice grim. "It confirms that Mr. Grant was not at home at the time of the poisoning." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight, and for a moment, she couldn't believe what she was hearing. She looked up at the officer, her heart pounding in her chest. Was this really happening? Had she finally been believed? The officer who had been questioning her gave a sharp nod, his expression changing. "You're telling the truth then," he said, his voice now filled with resolve. "Mr. Grant, you're under arrest." Anthony's face turned white as the officers moved toward him. The confidence he had been exuding moments ago evaporated, replaced by panic. He tried to argue, to claim that it was all a misunderstanding, but the evidence was clear now. Lucy watched as they cuffed him, his arrogance replaced by desperation. It was happening. It was really happening. He was going down, and she had finally won. As the officers led him out of the room, Lucy felt a wave of relief wash over her. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time that night she allowed herself to believe that she might actually be free, that this nightmare might finally end. As the door slammed shut behind Anthony, Lucy felt a strange weight lift off her chest. It wasn't the kind of relief that came from just escaping danger, but the kind that came from knowing she had done the right thing. She had stood up when everything seemed hopeless, and now it was over. The officers continued to talk among themselves, making arrangements to press charges against Anthony and start the legal process. But for Lucy, it felt like the world had shifted in a way she hadn't expected. She wasn't just a girl caught in the wrong place at the wrong time anymore. She was a survivor, someone who had fought back, who had refused to give in. She sat there in the station, the suitcase of money still in her hands, but it no longer held the same power over her. She had learned that money couldn't solve everything. It couldn't protect her, couldn't buy justice, and it certainly couldn't buy her happiness. As she sat there waiting for the officers to finish their work, a new realization began to dawn on her. She wasn't alone anymore. She had faced down Anthony, faced the whole world, and she had survived. But there was more to life than just survival. She could still remember the feeling of the cold, of being invisible to everyone around her, of the desperation that came from having no one to turn to. But now she had people who believed her. She had Julian, the officer who had helped her escape, and she had the officers who had finally seen the truth. She had Mr. Albert, the man who had survived because of her, and who now offered her a chance at a new life. The thought of Mr. Albert made her heart swell. He had been so kind to her, so understanding, and now he was giving her something she had never dared to hope for, a future. As she left the police station later that night, she walked with a new sense of purpose, carrying not just the suitcase but also the weight of everything she had overcome. She had done it. She had brought the truth to light. She had defeated the darkness that had haunted her life for so long, and now she had the chance to build a life, a real life, one filled with the warmth of kindness and the security of a future she could finally believe in. The next morning, the sky was bright and clear, a stark contrast to the dark, cold night she had just survived. Lucy stood outside the police station looking up at the sun, feeling the warmth of it on her face for the first time in what felt like forever. It wasn't just the sun that felt different. It was everything. The weight in her chest had lifted. The nightmare was over. Anthony was behind bars, and justice had been served. But more than that, she had found something even more valuable: hope. She had fought through the darkest night of her life, not just for survival, but for something bigger, something that couldn't be taken from her. As she looked back at the station, she felt a mixture of gratitude and relief. She wasn't the same person who had walked in there the night before. She had faced fear, doubt, and danger head-on, and she had come out on top. That was something no one could take away from her. She turned to Mr. Albert, who was standing beside her, offering her a kind smile. He had kept his promise to her, and now she had a place to call home. As she stepped forward, her mind was already filled with new possibilities. She was going to school. She was going to make friends. She was going to live a life, not just exist in the shadows. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every step. Looking back, she realized just how much she had changed. The world hadn't been kind to her, but she had learned something invaluable. The truth always comes out, and no matter how small or powerless you may feel, you can always rise. Lucy smiled, feeling a sense of peace that she hadn't known in years. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid to face it. She had the strength to build a future, to live the life she deserved. And that, she knew, was the real victory.